The Lodger is a horror noir from 1944. Cedric Hardwicke and Sara Allgood play a couple who rent a room to an eccentric man, played by Laird Cregar. During his time there, he starts to get to know their niece, played by Merle Oberon, and they start to form a small bond. But it just so happens that this story takes place during the height of a Jack the Ripper-like murderous rampage through the streets of London, and a Scotland Yard inspector, played by George Sanders, has Cregar on his list of suspects. As the clues mount, not only does Oberon suspect Cregar is the Ripper, but she also thinks she might be his next intended victim. The film is often called a remake of Alfred Hitchcock's 1927 silent film The Lodger, which also had to do with a couple renting out a flat to a man suspected of being a killer. But honestly, it's less of a remake of that film and more of a reimagining of the 1913 book both films are based off of. There aren't too many similarities thematically or story-wise, which was kind of a breath of fresh air when I first watched it. I was expecting a rehash of the same material, but I ended up getting a new story with a different set of interesting characters. Not only that, but this film does a great job blending genres. I always see people online classify this strictly as a noir or strictly as a horror film. For me, I really do think it's both. I mean, it's about a serial killer murdering defenseless women. That's the formula for pretty much every slasher ever made. But the look is distinctly noir. If Ingrid Bergman and Charles Boyer started strutting down the streets, I wouldn't bat an eye. I love these sequences where the camera prowls through the foggy parkways. There's something hauntingly beautiful about them that puts me on edge. There's also some eye-catching interior shots. It feels like these scenes are trying to convey that the characters aren't safe just because they're inside. They use the high contrast light to great effect. Easily, my favorite example of this is when an old woman, played by Doris Lloyd, comes home one night from the bar. Her apartment is cloaked in darkness, with the only available light piercing in from the window. All she does is trudge through the dark for a couple seconds to turn on a light, but those few seconds feel so much more exciting than they actually are. Like I mentioned before, this film has quite a few memorable characters. My biggest problem with films about Jack the Ripper is that he's very well developed and interesting, but everyone else around him is bland and boring. Here, that's not the case. The film has a rich cast that bring a lot to their roles. Cedric Hardwicke and Sara Allgood are surprisingly memorable as the owners of the flat. They aren't just the typical oblivious landlords. They also have their doubts about Cregar. They have a few engaging scenes where they debate with themselves and with others about their theories. I kinda wonder how the film would have played out if they were the central characters instead of George Sanders and Merle Oberon. And speaking of which, both of them are good too. Sanders, as per usual, brings a dry wit to his inspector role. This makes him more personable when compared to other detectives in stories like these. Many gaslight noirs have super serious inspectors, which I don't hate, but after you see a few of these, they all start to blend together. Not only does Sanders stick out, but he feels more like a person than a character. Because of this, I find myself more invested in him solving the case. Merle Oberon is pretty good in her role, and her character is pretty complex. At a glance, you might think she's a typical 40s horror damsel, but when you start to spend time with her, you realize she's actually a strong and independent thinker. Like many people, she falls for Cregar's charms at first, but she isn't totally oblivious the whole time. She picks up on things and quickly starts to form her own suspicions. But if you haven't guessed, the performance I'm highlighting is Laird Cregar, who I'm glad to see has been getting a lot more recognition lately. For most of the film, he's well-mannered and soft-spoken, but his face gives you a clue that not everything is what it seems. I especially loved the film's attention to his eyes. It feels like they're always giving a different performance from the rest of his body. You can sense his cold, unfeeling spirit lying dormant, but just itching to get out. I love how the film lights him. Everyone else is lit in a more natural fashion, but the filmmakers go out of their way to play around with shadows on him. They give Cregar an otherworldly feeling that makes you wonder if he's going to continue to act normal or if he's going to snap. The scenes where he finally shows his true colors are stellar too. Reviews of this movie back then were mixed, but everyone agreed that the strongest aspect to the film was Cregar's performance, and I wholeheartedly agree. Laird Cregar was born July 28, 1913 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Around 1936, he started acting with some local stock companies, but found very little success. He bounced back and forth between the Pasadena Playhouse and Philadelphia for a couple years, but was unable to make his big break. He was inspired to take a leap of faith and make his own break happen when he saw actor Robert Morley enjoying critical success in the play Oscar Wilde. Morley was close in height and build to Cregar, so Cregar thought producing his own version of the play, with him in the lead, would help replicate Morley's success and get him noticed. The gamble paid off, and Hollywood came calling. He signed a contract with 20th Century Fox, and his first credited role was in the Paul Muni picture Hudson's Bay. Most of his roles after that consisted of villains and heavies. Some of his most memorable parts were in This Gun for Hire, The Black Swan, and I Wake Up Screaming, all of which are performances I think are great. Cregar quickly became tired of being typecast and yearned for a more leading man status, similar to Tyrone Power or Alan Ladd. His big break came when he was given the leading role in this film, The Lodger, and funny enough, while doing research for this video, I found out the film Cregar made right before this was Holy Matrimony, the film I reviewed right before this one. Anyways, as I previously mentioned, Cregar gained a lot of critical acclaim for this film, and Fox decided to give him the leading role in his next project, Hangover Square. To prepare for this, Cregar went on a crash diet and lost almost 100 pounds. It was a strain on his system, but he was able to complete the movie. Afterwards, Cregar felt he needed to lose some more weight and decided to have stomach surgery. A few days after the procedure, he had a heart attack. He would die not long after, on December 9th, 1944. He was 31 years old. 2 months later, Hangover Square was released, and Cregar was praised again for his performance. In 1960, he was given a star on the Walk of Fame. In the last couple of years, Cregar's career and story have been rediscovered by many classic film fans, so he started to become less obscure as time's gone on. I've always thought he was an underrated actor, and I'm glad to see he's getting the respect he deserves. So if you want to join others in rediscovering Laird Cregar, or watch a film that has a great blend of horror and noir, then I highly recommend The Lodger.